Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at the European economy.
Okay.
We've got reports, expert analyses, even some stuff on consumer behavior.
Sounds interesting.
Yeah, it's a lot to cover.
Yeah.
But here's a fascinating fact to kind of kick things off. European consumers are saving more than anyone expected,
Really?
despite rising incomes and inflation easing up.
Wow, that's...
Yeah, they're sitting on their euros.
That-
So let's dive in and try to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, let's decode this whole inflation situation first.
Okay, so inflation has come down significantly in Europe from 10.6% to 1.7% in recent months.
Wow.
That sounds like good news, right?
It is positive for sure.
Yeah.
But the European Central Bank wants to see sustained 2% inflation by 2025
Oh, okay.
and is taking a cautious approach.
So, like, they're not getting ahead of themselves.
Exactly. Think of it like they're carefully landing a plane.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to celebrate too early.
Right. They want to make sure that this downward trend is going to stick. Can you unpack that a bit more for us? What's making them so cautious?
Well, there are a few factors at play.
Okay.
First, while goods inflation is down to a tiny 0.4% services, inflation is still high.
Oh, really? Why is that?
Well, think about things like dining out or getting a haircut.
Yeah.
These are labor-intensive industries, meaning wages make up a big chunk of their costs. As wages rise, the price of these services tends to follow.
Oh, so even though things are getting cheaper at the store, that trip to the restaurant might still put a dent in your wallet.
Exactly.
Interesting. What else is the ECB watching closely?
The second factor is something called underlying inflation.
Underlying inflation.
It's not just about the current numbers, it's about the trends driving them.
Uh-huh.
For example, even if overall inflation is low rising, energy costs could be pushing up service prices,
Yeah, that makes sense.
making things difficult for businesses and consumers alike.
Right.
The ECB needs to understand the bigger picture to be sure that this low inflation is here to stay.
So you need to look beyond the surface to get the whole story.
Exactly.
Got it.
The third factor is all about how effective the ECB's policies really are.
Okay.
When they raise interest rates, the goal is to slow down the economy and curb inflation.
Mm-hmm.
But are those actions actually having the desired effect?
Right.
It's called monetary policy transmission, and it's a complex process with a lot of moving parts.
It sounds like the ECB is trying to figure out if they're actually in control of the situation.
Right.
If their tools are having the impact they expect.
Precisely. They need to make sure their actions are effectively impacting things like borrowing costs and ultimately those inflation numbers.
Okay, so we've got this balancing act with inflation, and the ECB is taking a slow and steady approach. Now let's circle back to those European consumers who are saving more than expected.
Right.
Is this caution just a reflection of the ECB's approach, or is there something else going on?
It's likely a combination of factors.
Okay.
Remember the geopolitical uncertainties we mentioned earlier? The war in Ukraine and the conflict in the Middle East are contributing to a sense of economic anxiety.
Yeah.
People are holding on to their money, waiting to see what happens next.
So it's like even if my personal finances are okay, the news is making me nervous about the future.
Exactly.
Right.
And this is where cultural differences come into play.
Oh, okay.
European consumers tend to be more risk-averse than, say, American consumers.
Yeah.
They're historically more cautious even when economic conditions improve.
I see. It's not just about the numbers. It's about how people feel about those numbers.
Yes.
And that feeling, that sense of caution, is having a real impact on Europe's economic recovery.
Yes, it's definitely a factor, and this leads us to the question of what the ECB should do next.
Okay.
Their current monetary policy, including those interest rate hikes, is having some effect, but consumption and investment are still lagging.
So they're facing a dilemma. Do they keep raising rates to combat inflation even though that might further dampen economic activity?
Yeah.
Or do they consider cutting rates to try and stimulate growth, potentially risking a resurgence of inflation?
That's a tough call.
Yeah.
Some economists argue that rate cuts are necessary to boost the economy.
Okay.
But the ECB, true to its cautious nature, is hesitant to make any sudden moves, especially with inflation still above their target.
So they're walking a tightrope,
Yeah.
trying to find that sweet spot between controlling inflation and supporting economic growth.
Absolutely. And it's made even more challenging by the fact that Europe also needs some serious structural reforms to reach its full economic potential.
Structural reforms, this sounds like a whole other deep dive.
It is a complex topic,
Mhm.
but it's crucial for understanding Europe's economic future.
Okay, I'm all ears. What kind of makeover are we talking about here?
Well, one key area is productivity.
Okay.
Europe has been lagging behind other developed economies in this area.
Really?
It's not about working harder, it's about working smarter, being more innovative, and getting more output for the same input. When productivity suffers, so does economic growth.
Yeah. So it's about finding ways to do more with less, but how do you actually achieve that?
There's no easy answer.
Yeah.
It requires investment in education and technology, streamlining regulations, and fostering a business environment that encourages innovation.
That makes sense. What else is on Europe's economic makeover list?
Well, there's energy sovereignty.
Energy sovereignty.
This has become even more crucial given the geopolitical situation we've discussed.
Right.
Europe needs to reduce its reliance on external energy sources to become more resilient to global shocks.
So it's like you don't want to be dependent on someone else for something as essential as energy, especially when international relations are strained.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's why investing in renewable energy, improving energy efficiency, and diversifying energy sources are all critical for Europe's future.
Makes sense. Anything else?
Let's not forget labor market flexibility. Now, this is a sensitive topic with a lot of different perspectives.
Yeah.
Potentially, Europe needs to find ways to make its labor market more adaptable to changing economic conditions.
Okay, what does that mean in practical terms?
It could involve things like streamlining labor regulations, making it easier for businesses to hire and fire workers, and encouraging more flexible work arrangements.
Okay.
The goal is to reduce unemployment and boost competitiveness.
So it's about striking a balance between protecting workers' rights and making the labor market more responsive to the needs of businesses.
Yes.
I imagine this is a highly debated topic.
You're absolutely right. There are a lot of different opinions about the best way to approach labor market reform. Some people argue that too much flexibility could lead to exploitation of workers, while others believe that more flexibility is necessary to create jobs and boost economic growth.
It sounds like a complex issue with no easy answers.
It is, but the need for reform is undeniable. In fact, there's a report by former ECB President Mario Draghi that outlines many of these challenges and calls for urgent action.
Wow.
It's known as the Draghi Report, and it's essential reading if you really want to understand the issues facing Europe today.
The Draghi Report, we're going to have to check that out.
Yeah. So we've got productivity, energy sovereignty, and labor market flexibility. A pretty long to-do list for Europe's economic makeover.
It is, but those aren't the only challenges. Remember that financial puzzle we mentioned earlier?
Yeah.
Well, Europe still has some work to do in creating a truly unified financial system.
You're talking about the capital market union and banking union, right?
Exactly. Think of it this way. Imagine trying to build a house, but all the tools and materials are scattered across different towns.
Okay.
With different rules and regulations in each town, you would be incredibly inefficient, right?
Yeah, that sounds like a logistical nightmare.
Well, that's kind of what's happening with capital markets in Europe.
Oh.
They're fragmented, making it harder for businesses to access the funding they need to grow.
Right.
A capital market union would help to streamline things, create a deeper, more liquid market for capital, and ultimately boost investment and economic growth.
So it's about creating a single, more efficient market for capital across Europe. And what about banking union? What are the challenges there? One of the biggest hurdles is creating a unified deposit insurance system across all EU countries.
Okay.
This is essential for building trust and stability in the banking sector.
Why is that such a big deal?
Imagine if your bank went bust, but your deposits were only insured up to a certain amount because of where you lived. That wouldn't inspire much confidence in the banking system, would it?
Definitely not. So a unified deposit insurance system would create a level playing field and make people feel more secure about their savings no matter where they bank in Europe.
Precisely. But that's a complex issue given the different banking regulations and cultures across the EU.
Yeah, it's starting to feel like every aspect of the European economy is interconnected, like a giant, intricate web.
It absolutely is. And to fully understand those connections, we need to step back and consider the global context. Europe doesn't exist in a vacuum after all.
Right, we can't ignore the geopolitical situation with the U.S. and China. It's like Europe is caught in this global tug-of-war between these two economic superpowers.
That's a great analogy, and it raises an important question. How can Europe maintain its own economic strength and sovereignty in this increasingly multipolar world?
That's a question for the next part of our deep dive, right?
Okay, we'll explore that and more when we return. Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about all those challenges the European economy is facing and how they're all kind of tied up with what's happening globally. It's a pretty complex picture, for sure.
It is. We talk about inflation, those cautious consumers, the need for some pretty big structural reforms, even a bit about Europe's financial system. But now I'm really interested to explore that global tug of war you mentioned. How can Europe keep up economically when it's caught between the U.S. and China?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's something a lot of policymakers are trying to figure out.
Yeah.
Europe needs to find ways to attract investment, encourage innovation, and hold its own as a global economic power, all while navigating those rising geopolitical tensions.
Right. It's a tough balancing act. So why should all of this matter to our listeners? What's the connection to their lives?
Well, think about it this way. Europe plays a big role in the global economy. What happens there has a ripple effect on things like global trade investment flows, even currency exchange rates.
Oh, so what happens in Europe doesn't stay in Europe.
Exactly. It affects everyone.
Right.
And as individuals, we're all part of this big interconnected system.
Okay.
Decisions made by governments and central banks ultimately have a real impact on our everyday lives.
That's a good point. We might not always see that direct connection, but we're all part of the same economic ecosystem.
Exactly. Speaking of which, let's shift gears and talk about trade.
Okay.
Our sources are pretty clear on their stance. Fair trade is essential for global growth, innovation, and productivity.
It's like that saying, a rising tide lifts all boats.
Yeah.
When countries work together and trade freely, everyone benefits in the long run, right?
Exactly. Protectionism might seem appealing at first, but in the long run, it can actually stifle economic growth and innovation.
Right, it can backfire.
Yeah, the sources really emphasize this, particularly now with all the geopolitical tensions and uncertainty in the world.
It seems like when things get tough globally, cooperation and open dialogue become even more important, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And this leads us to another key point from our sources, the importance of independent central banks.
Yes. Please remind us why central bank independence is so crucial.
Imagine a central bank making decisions based on short-term political pressures. That wouldn't exactly inspire confidence, would it?
No, not at all.
They wouldn't be able to make the tough calls needed to maintain price and financial stability. They'd be above the political fray.
So it's about letting them focus on their core mandate, keeping the economy on track without being swayed by political whims.
Exactly, and this connects back to the ECB's current situation and their cautious approach to managing inflation.
Right.
They need that independence to make the right decisions for the long-term health of the European economy, even if those decisions aren't always popular in the short term.
It's like having a captain who can steer the ship through rough waters without being pressured by the passengers.
That's a great way to put it.
So taking a step back, what's the main takeaway here? What are the sources ultimately trying to convey about the state of the European economy?
I think the core message is that Europe has a solid economic blueprint, but needs more unity and action to truly thrive.
Okay.
There are key areas that need attention, like labor market flexibility, productivity, and banking integration. Those structural reforms we discussed are essential.
So it's not just about tweaking things around the edges. Europe needs to make some fundamental changes to reach its full economic potential.
While the ECB is doing what it can to manage inflation, those deeper structural changes are needed to address the wider economic challenges.
Like what?
Things like boosting productivity, ensuring energy sovereignty, and creating a more integrated and efficient financial system.
And they need to do all of this while navigating a complex geopolitical landscape, balancing their relationships with both the U.S. and China. It's a tall order for sure.
It is. But as our sources emphasized, peace is ultimately the foundation for sustainable prosperity. It's hard to focus on economic growth and innovation when the world feels uncertain and unstable.
That's such a powerful point, and it's something we should all reflect on. Peace isn't just a political ideal, it's an economic necessity.
Absolutely. So for our listeners, the next time you come across a news report about the European economy, or any economy for that matter, remember the things we've discussed today.
Right.
Think about those underlying forces at play, the interconnectedness of the global system, and the role we all have in shaping the future, because the more informed and engaged we are, the better equipped we'll be to navigate the complexities of the world around us.
And maybe we can even help solve some of those complex puzzles along the way.
Exactly.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the European economy. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, haven't we? From inflation and consumer behavior to the European Central Bank and the need for some pretty big structural reforms. It's like we've been putting together this massive, complex puzzle. It is a complex picture for sure, but
Hmm.
all these pieces are interconnected from the local level all the way up to global geopolitics,
Mhm.
and what happens in Europe has ripple effects that can be felt worldwide.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we're all part of the same economic ecosystem, even if we don't always see those connections in our daily lives.
Absolutely. And understanding those connections is crucial for navigating, the complexities of the 21st century. It's
Yeah.
about informed citizenship. Really being aware of the forces shaping our world empowers us to participate in the conversations that will ultimately determine our collective future. That's what the deep dive is all about, isn't it? We're not just here to present information. We're here to encourage you to think critically, to connect the dots, and to draw your own conclusions to see the bigger picture, so to speak.
Exactly. It's about empowering our listeners to become active participants in shaping the world they want to live in.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into the European economy, what are some key takeaways our listeners should keep in mind?
Well, first and foremost, the challenges facing Europe are significant, but they're not insurmountable. There's a roadmap for success,
Hmm.
but it requires unity action and a commitment to making some tough choices.
It's about more than just tweaking things around the edges. Europe needs to embrace those deeper structural changes we talked about, those reforms that could truly unlock its economic potential.
Exactly. And while the European Central Bank is focused on managing inflation, those broader reforms are needed to address the wider economic challenges, things like boosting productivity, ensuring energy sovereignty, and creating a more integrated and efficient financial system.
And they need to do all of this while navigating a complex geopolitical landscape, balancing their relationships with both the US and China. It's a tall order, for sure.
It is. But, as our sources emphasized, peace is ultimately the foundation for sustainable prosperity. It's hard to focus on economic growth and innovation when the world feels uncertain and unstable.
That's such a powerful point, and it's something we should all reflect on. Peace isn't just a political ideal, it's an economic necessity.
Absolutely.
So, to wrap up our deep dive into the European economy, thanks for joining us. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.